guys, it's Robin, RsIslandCrafts, and welcome to my craft room. Today we are going to be working on doing some free motion quilting on our little mini stack. I'm going to start you guys off at this angle, and in a minute I'm going to zoom you in down here so you can see everything that's going on. And then partway through I'm going to go ahead and switch you guys over so you can see it from another angle, just to make sure you can see everything you need to see, okay? Now, free motion quilting is the type where you can do, there's a lot of various parts of it and different ways to do it. We're gonna go do a meander that just kind of wanders and kind of wiggly squigglies all over the quilt. Certain tools we're gonna need, of course, we're gonna need to have our sewing machine. I have our mini stacks quilt here. Now today I am going to use a green thread on the front and a green thread on the bobbin, and mostly because I normally wouldn't do that on this quilt. I would probably pick just a white because of all the white in the background, but I want us to be able to see any mistakes I make by accident, but I'm also going to make mistakes on purpose, just so you guys can see what they look like and what might be causing them for you. This is going to be a little mini quilt for my house. I'm not sure what I'm going to use it for. Maybe I'll just give it to the cats to take naps underneath, or I could still hang it up on the wall. But most of my mistakes are going to end up showing on the back and not the front, so it's going to be okay. Normally when I start free motion quilting, every time I've done it, even if I did it yesterday, I will do a little practice on a sandwich before I get into this. Maybe I'll take 2 pieces of 12.5-inch fabric and a piece of batting inside, just to give my hands some practice with my hands and feet getting together and getting coordinated, so that when I get right into my quilt, any type of warming up and mistakes, I'm going to make it on my practice piece and not on this one. Now that practice piece can be used over and over again. You can like super quilt all over it, or you can just do it a little bit and then turn it into mug rugs or tote bags or something like that. I cannot do free motion quilting unless I have some type of gloves. Now these are quilting gloves. They just happen to be a great bright color. They are from Fons and Porter. I picked them up at Joann's. I used the 50% off coupon, and I bought these probably 10-15 years ago. They're just like gardening gloves. They're a very soft, cottony, stretchy material, but on the bottom it has a whole bunch of little rubber dots all over it. And that's going to allow me to easily hold onto the quilt and get it to slide around. I do wear both of them at the same time because I'm going to be moving my hands around a lot like this. And this just helps me move the quilt. I have a table on my Juki here. I'm sewing on a Juki HZL F600. This has a table that comes on and off. Otherwise, I have a little bit of the regular looking sewing machine there. And this gives me a lot of room to support my quilt so that it's not hanging off the edge and like dragging or anything. I'm on a large table. I'm on a small quilt, so I don't have to worry too much about what goes off on the edge this way. I can slide my machine over a little if I need to. I like to have it so that my needle is centered right in front of me. That just gives me that little bit of ease of movement. If I were doing, say I was doing a twin size quilt, I would go ahead and make sure that on my left hand side and behind my sewing machine that I have some tables set up. Whether I go ahead and get some of those wooden TV trays and just line them up next to me. I have my table in front of here. I just want my quilt to be supported, because while I'm quilting, if my quilt is falling off of the table and it's not being supported at all, that weight is going to drag my quilt down, and I'm going to be fighting against the weight of the quilt. So you want to make sure you have plenty of space in front of you to support your quilt and off to the side. I have quilted up against the wall before with a small amount of space, and it does make it much more difficult because your quilt doesn't have any room to move around and breathe. With this machine, it's meant for quilting, so I have a lot of extra space over here on the right hand side of my needle, but I have done it on a regular Brothers sewing machine, and I've done a king size quilt for my son that was 102 by 102. So you can do it. It's just going to depend on how much manipulation you have. We're just doing a mini quilt here today, so even a smaller machine, you're still going to be able to just kind of roll up your quilt like this, and you'll be able to move around nicely. You're going to need a special free motion quilting foot. I have one that is a complete circle. A lot of people prefer the ones that are more shaped like a C with a section cut out. This is the way I've learned on it. I'm used to it. I can see really well with it. Some people like to use a plastic one that you can see through. I don't have any problem with using the full one. This one has a screw that allows me to adjust the height and the tension on this foot. So if I have a thicker quilt, it allows me to bring the foot up higher. This is a thinner quilt, so I can bring it down lower. You want it to be hovering. For me, I like it about 1/4 inch or less. I don't want it up too high because I need to make sure that my needle's going to be going all the way through, and I don't want it to be, I want my quilt to stay nice and secure underneath it and not have a lot of movement. So for me, I have to take off. I have one of those snap-on shanks, but I do have to use my handy little tool that came with my machine. And I have to take off the top shank and the foot, and then set those aside where you're not going to lose them. Follow your manual, look up your videos on YouTube to see exactly how your free motion foot goes in. The basics of it are about the same with every machine. Some of them all will look a little bit different than the others depending on what your machine needs, but for the most part they are the same. Now with my sewing machine, I have to remove this here, and I have a little switch down here that allows me to drop my feed dogs. Your feed dogs are these little metal walkie things that kind of feed the fabric through. And we don't want it to be feeding our fabric, our quilt through straight when we're going to be going in circles and sideways and all around. So I'm going to drop my feed dogs. If your machine doesn't allow you to drop the feed dogs, you can put your stitch length down to 0. I've been told that that works really well. On my old machine, my feed dogs, I dropped them once in the very beginning. I bought a sold as is. It was a little bit banged up in the box, but the machine looked perfectly fine from Walmart. But come to find out that once I dropped my feed dogs, I couldn't get them to physically come back up, even with getting inside the machine and doing it. Once I finally got it to where I can get them to pop up, I never wanted to drop my feed dogs again. So what I did is I created a little bit of a thing here. And this is just a piece of cardboard, and I put some tape on the side, put a little hole somewhere in it so that when I put it underneath here, it would cover my feed dogs, but it'd have a spot for my needle, because your needle's never going to move position. So I would tape these down with some blue painter's tape to keep it from moving. This, I do have a new one that I've used since then, before I got this machine. This hole has been eaten up by the feed dogs, so it is a little bit too large. You want it to be just enough that your needle is going to be going up and down through your little holes here, and that's about it. And what this does is the feed dogs will move on this cardboard, and they won't actually touch onto my quilt. It does the same thing. Your feed dogs are still going to be moving, but as I said, I did that before I knew to drop my stitch length down to 0, and it does about the same thing. So that's another option there. I said I am using green thread. I have it in the top of my machine and in my bobbin. I highly suggest to make sure you have enough bobbins threaded prior to starting. If you're doing a king size quilt, thread enough bobbins, wind enough bobbins to get you through at least that 1 day of sewing. And then you can always do more at the end of the day or before you start quilting the next day. It is really aggravating to stop in the middle of a quilt while you find your rhythm and you're going to go ahead and have to wind a new bobbin. I only have one full one here because I'm going to guess that based on a height of a stitch I'm going to do, I should only need one. If I need another, I can just pop something in. I have my container of safety pins over here open on my right hand side, so if any of my pins get in the way as I'm quilting, I can easily take them off and just put them into my container. If you like to sew in total silence, you're all set, but if you like a little background noise like I do, I like to wear headphones, and I'll put in maybe a Netflix movie, something that's going to give me a reference of time. I'll also know that, so if it's like a 1 hour YouTube video or a 2 hour movie, that I can gauge how long it's been taking me. I don't want to sit here 2 hours is tops for me. I don't want to sit here for very long because you're going to get tension in your shoulders and in your hands and fingers and arms and all that. Your back's going to get a little sore. So either set a timer for yourself. So after about an hour to 2 hours, you're going to get up and walk around. I'm sure someone says you should do it every 20 minutes, but once I get into that rhythm, as long as I'm feeling good and my body's not sore, I'm going to keep going. Otherwise, put on some music. If you are new at free motion quilting, maybe not put on the fastest music because we tend to groove and do things to the music. We want something at a medium beat, not too slow, but not super fast, just so that we can we'll quilt to the rhythm. Okay, get my gloves on. Now when I start my free motion quilting, I like to start up at the top. I tend to free motion quilt either based on the blocks that I have, or for a quilt this size, I'll turn it into quarters. So I will go ahead and free motion either the entire right side or the first top quarter of it. This one is pretty small, so I think I will be able to just go ahead and do this. As you can see, my quilt can move easily all the way around. I have nothing it's getting hung up on. I have enough lighting so I can see. When I start, I'm going to start off of my quilt. That way when I trim off my excess batting and backing, then I won't have any weird stitches that are in my quilt. They'll be all out here. If you want, you can go ahead and do a little bit of practice on this outside part, so you can kind of get the rhythm of your hands and your foot. Because with free motion quilting, the whole thing is you need to move your hands and your feet at the same speed. So with free motion quilting, you want to make sure your hands are going at the same speed as your foot. If your hands are going to go faster, you're going to get some eyelashes. If your hands are going slower than your foot, then you're going to get these itty bitty bitty tiny stitches, and that's not that good either, especially if something happens, you have to pick them out. I just find my rhythm a little, and I'm just going to take my hands and I'm going to move my quilt. Now for this one, I'm going to try not to cross over any of the stitches I've previously done. It is not a crisis if you cross over the stitches. It's not that big of a deal. It's just one of the things that I like to practice when I'm doing it. Another thing with free motion quilting is you can also quilt in designs. So I can quilt a star into it just by eyeballing what it's going to look like. And it's like cursive writing. When you stop in one spot, you want to make sure your needle stays down. So if your machine has a needle down position, that's great. Otherwise, you're going to have to crank it down to make sure it stays down. That way you're staying in the same spot where you finished off. So that my line is going to be continuous now. Now, of course, I've crossed over the lines for my star, so it's not going to be uncrossed over, which is perfectly fine. I just want to do it so that I'm not always in one area. For this one, I want to have big swooping loops and little flows of everything. I don't want to have everything really nice and tight. What I like to do is if I know who this quilt is going to, let's say I was giving this to, my daughter for Christmas or something, I might put Love Mom in it in the quilting. I could put each of my kids' name in it. If I'm keeping it for myself, I can go ahead and quilt the year right into it, just by moving my quilt around, and my needle's going to stay in the right position. I already have this little spring set up for the type of batting that I used. I have that 100% cotton batting. It's really thin, so I don't need to have a lot of space between the circle part of my foot and the quilt. I'm going to do my best to move around my pins as I go so I don't get hooked up into it. You kind of want to know where you've been and where you're going when you free motion quilt. Of course, you can use any type of marking tool that works on a quilt that's non-permanent to do your little stars, hearts, or the words that you want in it, so that you can just trace over it like we did with our kids when they were little and they were learning how to write. So I gave myself just that little bit. As I said, it's good to do a little 5 or 10 minute practice session on something small, but I'm just going to go ahead and get into it, because if I make a mistake, I kind of want to make mistakes so you guys can see what they look like. I'm going to bring myself up down into my quilt now. I have to be careful because I want to make sure my fabric is going under my foot at the edge of my quilt top, so I'll go slow there because otherwise your foot can go right underneath the fabric. Find my rhythm. Then I just kind of wiggle squiggle. If you have a same color thread on the top as you do on the bottom, then if you have any type of a tension issue, it's not going to be noticed. After you've been quilting for a little bit, or in the very beginning, if you're curious, you might want to go ahead and take a peek just to see how your stitches are looking here, to make sure they're all close to even. Whenever I get near the edges, I want to make sure that my batting and my backing aren't folded on top of my quilt or folded underneath. That's a really common mistake, and then you'll have to go through and you'll have to pick out all of your quilting to release this, because otherwise you're going to have it backwards on the back of your quilt, and that's not nice. For me, quilts have two sides, even wall hangings, so you want both sides to look pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and spend a little bit of time just moving this through, watching out for my pins. I can go ahead and go off the edge of my quilt if I want. We're going to put binding on this anyway, so not all of your quilting and stuff is going to be, you know, within the quilt. I'm using the green thread, so it's going to be really obvious for me, but if you're using a matching thread, it'll be very subtle in the background and it won't be noticed. So this pin is going to be an issue. I'm going to go ahead and take this one out. A little bit harder to work with the gloves on, but they make a big difference. Some people have like hoops that they put on this, so they just put it in the hoop and do it, but then you've got to keep moving the hoop. So that just never made sense to me. I like to go slow near my corners just to make sure they don't get folded under. And now I'm just going to go ahead and start doing it at my normal speed, and I won't speed the video up just so you can see how fast I go. I have a speed control on my machine. I can slow it down, so if my foot is going crazy, I can slow my foot pedal down to match my hands a little bit better. It's not about how fast you can go, it's about how getting your stitches to look nice. As I get more practicing again, and because I haven't been quilting in a very while, because you guys see what I make. I haven't done too much quilting lately, especially free motion. Then I'm just going to go relatively slow until I find that rhythm again. So I just work around those pins. I'm not doing a specific design, so I just got to make sure they're not going to get hooked up with anything. I can come back up into here, fill in some spaces. I don't want to leave big glaring gaps in where I have quilted and where I haven't. The tighter you quilt, meaning the closer your lines are, the denser your quilt is going to be, and it's not going to be nice and soft and fluffy if you're going to sleep under it. For a wall hanging, having a little denser is not a problem. So I'm going to go over to the edge here so that I can stop and peek and see what the back looks like. See if I have, when you're going to get eyelashes when you do the curvy loops and stuff like that. So those are looking pretty good. I don't have long loose stitches back there. The front I can see, and that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to keep going on this side here, and once I get to the bottom, I'm going to move the sewing machine to the other side. I'll make a few mistakes so that you guys can see what it looks like. Maybe I'll make my mistakes on the outside so that this part of my quilt stays all nice and pretty. That would be a smart little thing to do, right? Wherever you want to put your hands, you'll see me moving mine all around. I don't like to keep it too close because I need to be able to see where I'm going and where I've been. If this works for you, then go ahead, especially if you're doing some really intense, maybe you're doing the pebbles, the little circles over and over again, so you might need to be a little bit more, right down into it. I can start off the quilt, get my practice going back in, be careful going back on. Sometimes I might have to lift my foot up a little. I find it's better for me to keep going and not to stop than it is to you know, go really slow in spots, because once I get my rhythm going, I can get going, and then I don't have to worry about it as much. Keep an eye out for the pins. See my quilt's going forwards and backwards and sideways. Sometimes I'll get going like this and I'll spin my quilt. If you have some really thick seams, you go a little bit slower if you know where they are, like if you're doing half square triangles, because that's when you can really get hung up with the foot of your machine or the needle. Now I just have this little bottom section, so maybe I'll just turn it this way and I can work in this direction. You see I'm avoiding putting too much of my quilt over here. I'm going to quilt right up towards the edge and I'm going to come back in. I can see where I'd left off. Even if you're using matching thread, you're going to be able to see where you'd already quilted. I can really feel those seams. The slower I go, the more I can feel the seams, which is not a reason to go faster, but once you get comfortable, you'll be able to. Now, if you've been going and sewing for a while, and you have a feeling like your bobbin's going to run out, I like to get to the edge of my quilt so I can peek in and see. That's the best part about having a clear bobbin up on the top. I can see through and make sure that, okay, I still got plenty. I can go back and do the next part of the quilt. When I look at my bobbin, even if it's only like a quarter left, if I know I need to do a whole section over here and I don't want to worry about it running out, I'll go ahead and change that bobbin, because it's annoying when you end up in the center of your quilt and you have to change out the bobbin, because then you have those ends that you have to tie in little knots and then hide inside the quilt. But if I always start and end at the side of my quilt off into the batting, then I don't have to worry about that at all. Now see, in just that little bit of amount that we've been talking, I didn't go exactly down the half, but I've gotten most of that done. So I'm going to go ahead and switch the machine around and then zoom in really tight so you can see it from the side angle to maybe get a little bit of a different perspective to see how it's going. We'll go ahead and quilt this other side together, and then I will make a bunch of mistakes out in the border so we can check that out. So I'm going to leave everything connected. At the end of the night, I do try to get to the end of my quilt, so I'm going off into the border, and I will bring my needle up and turn it off and all of that, just so that I don't like to leave my needle sitting all the way down in the fabric. Plus, who knows how long it might be before I get back to quilting on this, especially if you have a specific quilting machine and then you have one that you do for your piecing and stuff, because I know some of you hardcore quilters have more than one sewing machine. So this could be sitting for a while. So, all right, give me a second and I'll get everybody all rearranged. Now, when I set up my machine, you need to check with yours to see how it's going to do for your free motion. I have my needle straight in the center of my machine, so it's right in the center of my little circle of my foot. Once again, stitch length can be down to 0, it can be up to 6. It doesn't really matter because our hands are going to determine the stitch length. Whatever thread you and your machine like, I just like to use the essential threads. It's 100% cotton, I believe, from Connecting Threads. It comes in a wide variety of fun colors. I think I'm going to make some of our mistakes down here. Now, some of the mistakes you can make is if your hands and your feet aren't going at the same speed. If I don't move my quilt at all, my needle's just going to sit here and go up and down in one spot because there's no feed dogs moving it. I have to be the one to move it around. I love doing loops and stars and hearts and writing and stuff. Now, if my hands go faster than my foot, I get really large, big stitches. One of the problems you can have is you can have eyelash stitches. when you're doing loops, if your hands get going faster than your foot, your stitches up top might not look so bad. Now it's not good. I quilted myself in. It's not going to be as dramatic as the way I just made it. Sometimes you're just going to get moving and you're going to be in your groove, and before you know it, you've gotten a little bit off kilter. Now you see these stitches here that look like little eyelashes coming off the main line? That's what they mean by eyelash stitches. That because you're moving your machine, you're moving your quilt too fast with your hands before the foot pedal and the speed of the machine can get the stitches made. So you end up with these. Now these become a weak spot on here, so that's not something you want to have. That's one of the things I noticed the most, that I make a mistake on my back of my quilt, because the front of it might look pretty good. You know, all of my stitches here aren't too big. They're looking okay, relatively well. But when I see back here, I can see those eyelashes. And that happens a lot when you're doing these little curves and loops like this. So it doesn't have to be all big and dramatic. Just these little ones right here can be enough to give you eyelashes. Now mine are looking pretty good, but they're close. See, everything's lined up really good there. It's just, I can see it because I know what it's going to look like, so it almost looks like there's going to be a problem. So even an experienced quilter, you may be able to tell from the front when you're starting to make problems on the back, but it's always good to check the back of your quilt and not wait till you get to the very end of it. That's heartbreaking. Been there, done that, even on something this small. So I'm going to start off of here again. I think those are the main mistakes you're going to make. It's usually just when your hands aren't coordinated to your foot, whether your hands are going too slow or they're going too fast. You just want to get, it really is a dance. It's a rhythm that you have to find for yourself, and the only way to get it is to practice. And I started out, I taught myself how to free motion quilt because my old brother's sewing machine and my Singer sewing machine that I started with, when they did straight line stitching, there was no walking foot, so there was always bunches up in the back. There was always fabric that got folded over. Now that can happen here too, but we did a decent job with our pins, so I don't see any type of puckers in the section we already did. So everything is looking pretty good through there. As I said, I haven't done free motion quilting in a while, so this does take a little bit of practice. I can see some slight eyelashing that wants to start, but I think this quilt is going to be fine as a wall hanging. Even if it gets washed several times, it's going to hold together fine. So if you made one that you made it and you're like, oh, I didn't really like it, and then like me, you made a second one with the green one, then it might be a good idea to use the first one as practice. That's why I said earlier in this series, if you've made a mistake on this and you don't quite like the way it looks, or like mine where the red bled and stuff like that, save this one, because this is a really great one to practice your free motion quilting on if you haven't done it before, or if you're like me and haven't done it in a while and you need a bit of practice. So let's start this back up again. If you want, you can go ahead and bring your bobbin thread to the top. I'm off to the side, so I don't really worry about that too much. It's going to do it on its own. Then I'm just going to find my rhythm. I like to have a decent amount of fabric on the side here of my quilt, so sometimes I will end up turning it this way, even though I'm putting more into my throat area here, but I like to have something for my hands to grab onto. Now if I'm coming along here and for whatever reason I want to go right here, I'll just stop, make sure my needle's down, pull out my pin, and then that way I can continue on. When I stop and then I go to continue on again, I like to put 1 or 2 stitches in this space so that I'm not taking a giant stitch, because for when I do it, I tend to accidentally take a giant stitch. I have this extra that I put in my lap. Now since this is a wall hanging, I tend to just put it like a bib up onto the top of my shirt, like up on my chest and stuff. I don't hold it with my chin or anything. I just like it to lay there because once again, it's stopping that weight from laying in your lap. You have to do a little readjusting as you go. So a couple stitches in place and then I continue on. You can go fast in certain areas and then slow it down a little bit when you're making a curve so you don't get those eyelashes, and then pick it back up. If you're just wiggling and squiggling, you're usually okay. It's these big turnarounds that'll get you. You have to go off of the quilt for a second, take a breath, then you don't have to worry about doing the stitches in place, and then you can come back on. Loop around my pins. And I see, okay, I haven't come over here and done much quilting, so I'll come over here and add a little bit in. Come back around. Maybe I want to come down some more. You just want to fill in the space, and depending on how you want it. Uh-oh, just went over a pin because I was talking and not paying attention. I hit a pin. Now, thankfully, I look like I didn't break my needle or anything like that, which is a possibility. I just need to get this pin out of here. Sometimes you'll quilt the pin right into place, and you might have to cut a thread. Some people say they only go in one direction, like they only quilt like this way, so their fabric is going, their quilt's going away from them. And then they turn the quilt around and quilt it again in that same direction. As you can see, I just weeble wobble all over the place. But if you're chatting and not paying attention, or you're too busy watching that movie, you could easily do something and hit a pin. Now you can break that needle, and that needle can either, well, chances are it's going to come up, but you could lose that tip down inside the machine, or you can get poked in the eye or in your cheek. Now I've cut my cheek before from the needles popping up and hitting me, so it's a serious thing, so you need to be careful. Plus, you just don't want to mess up your quilting, right? Okay, my needle seems fine. Now I've got to watch behind to see, one, where the needles are, to keep my fabric here out of the way so I don't fold it under, and also to make sure I'm filling in all the spaces. I don't want to get the whole thing done and find out right here I didn't put any stitching right, and there's no quilting in that section, because then I'll have to go back in and do the quilting right there, and I'm going to have to bury the beginning threads and the ending threads, and you're just giving yourself extra work. Look up, check your bobbin, however your bobbin situation where it's located, and start back up. Just take your time and do what feels comfortable, and if you have to go at the turtle speed, then that is perfectly fine. As long as your stitches are going to look nice and everything is going to get quilted and done, then you will work on your speed later. I got hooked up on a seam there. And this is why when you're making your blocks, they tell you to make sure your seams are nice and flat, because it causes an issue when you're quilting. Now you can see I've wandered far away from where I started, and yeah, that's what I do. I hit that seam. I probably would have been better off to put a brand new needle in before quilting this. That's a very good point. As you see, I'm struggling when I hit these seams. If you have a nice sharp needle brand new in before you start your quilting, then you're going to have an easier time of it. If you're like me and you're like, well, I just put a new needle in last week, what you can do is you can take your old needle out, put it in a piece of felt or a piece of paper, and put the date on it or something, put a brand new needle in, and then just go ahead and do your quilting. That way you can still use that other needle. You don't feel like you wasted it because you've only put a week's worth of sewing on it, but it's a really good idea to have a brand new needle. So it's a good thing I didn't bother changing out my needle so that I can have that little bit of an oops for you guys, right? So this is where you're going to get in trouble. Like when I'm pulling the quilt towards me, I have to pull it at an equal speed and pressure, and I've got to watch behind me for where those pins are. That's why I tend to get more into moving things around like this, because as I'm going sideways or towards me, I have a better idea where it is. Plus, I like this thing, like, well, in my mind, sometimes if I've got a quilt on me and I can see the quilting like this, then maybe I might want to follow it around. And it's kind of boring if it's all like this, all in one spot. That's my opinion personally. Totally up to you, but I like to kind of meander and wander around. Yeah, I'll loop around a pin, come back in. You can do a big circle loop-de-loop. I don't want to leave that space too empty, so I practice looping to the left, and I practice looping to the right. So for this quilt, it can be like a string of lights. Almost done. Let's do another little loop-de-loop. Those are the ones you have to be careful with so you don't get the eyelashes. That's it. Quilt's done. So there we go. We are all done. We have got our quilting everywhere. The other side looks pretty good too. I don't see any glaring. I'm sure if I follow it around, I'll say, oh, well, there's a little there and a little there. But overall, it looks really great. And for not having practiced first or have done free motion quilting in a while, I think everything looks good. My loops are pretty decent. I am very happy with the way this looks. So I really like the way this turned out. Even though I used the bold green thread, it is Christmassy, so the green will go ahead and work. So I think overall it does look really nice. The back looks pretty good. The green actually works really well back here because we have all the green dowels and everything like that, so that is nice. So once you get everything quilted, your next step for next week is to go ahead. We're going to remove all of our pins. I'm going to trim up my quilt and make it all nice and square. And then we're going to do the binding. Now, I showed you guys how to trim up square up your quilt. You guys got videos for that. I have several videos for doing the binding. So what we're going to do when we do the binding next week is I'm going to show you how to go ahead and start it and end with the mitered corner so that we're not having to, remember before I showed you that little trick where you could tuck it in so you didn't have to worry about matching it up and getting everything exact? Well, when we do this next week, I'm going to go ahead and show you how to do that so that you can go ahead and have it look the same all the way through. Many times I've had a butt up edge and then all of where I put my binding together is on the diagonal, so it's kind of nice to have it all match. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and leave them down below in the comments. Thanks for hanging out with me this week, and please tune in next week when we will do our binding. Bye.